Hi, this is Jason Shulman. I'd like to welcome you to a discussion about what is non-duality. Um, this is part of a series that the Foundation for Non-Duality is holding, and I'm glad that all of you have come online to discuss this important question. Okay, that's the formal part of my presentation. Let me just say this, though. We have a very kind of warm spring-like day after some very bitter days here. But walking to the office here to talk to you all was really a pleasure. So it feels very good. On the other hand, I feel a certain amount of frustration in having chosen this topic. I chose it freely. Nobody forced me. And after all, we are the Foundation for Non-Duality. So the fact that a group of people put their time and effort into creating this foundation must mean that non-duality is important in some way. My frustration comes about because to capture what non-duality is in a very few minutes of presentation is extremely difficult. Let me just back up for a second and say that our backstage people, Jared Drake and Julie Coriel, are here to work with all of the technology. I'm going to just speak for a while, and then I'm going to bring in my friend Tim Rothschild, and we'll continue the conversation based on, I don't know, based perhaps on what I say or what I didn't say. And then we're going to open it up for questions from everybody listening. So back to my frustration. Non-duality is really about the poetry of the world. In the same way a poem, each word in a poem is there for a reason. And unlike prose, if you edit a poem, so to speak, once it's finished, a lot of editing beforehand, but once it's in place, a poem works because everything is connected. And non-duality is about this infinitely deep and beautiful connection that the world has. Without the poetry, without being in person with everybody, which would be my absolute favorite thing to do, we're left with facts. Non-duality is extremely important because it shows us a picture of the world and the world's poetry, how the world is put together. That's extremely important for us in this day and age when there is, especially now when there is so much conflict, ecological disaster, difficulty politically and otherwise, and of course the pandemic, which has isolated people so deeply. So non-duality is an extremely important description of the world. And I hope I'll be able to explain that non-duality, rather than being a separate perspective or a philosophical perspective, it's really an observation that is so deep that it really underlies every spiritual path, whether the path is deistic and dualistic, such as Western religions, or non-deistic paths like Buddhism and so on. So it's very important for us, and it's very important for me to try to convey some of the poetic, which is to say relational and interconnected aspects of what non-duality is. There's a lot of misconceptions about what non-duality is from my perspective, and I hope I can make some of that clear. So let me start by reading a typical, actually I have two here in my notes, two perspectives about what non-duality is. Let me read. The first says, the non-dual perspective says that all things are interconnected. So far, okay. You are one with everything in the universe, part of the whole, unlike duality, which means two, not one, the world and you, other people and you. So there's already a demarcation being made. The second one, the mind finds it difficult to accept the concept of non-duality because it does not accept the world is a creation of the mind and the five senses, and that it is not real. To understand what non-duality is, you have to be in a state beyond words and thinking, empty of all mental content. This requires the ability to silence the mind. In this silence, you realize the real meaning of non-duality. Those are pretty typical descriptions of non-duality. And as you can hear, both of those descriptions have a lot to do with a particular experience of oneness and particular perspectives that arise from that experience of oneness. What I'd like to share with you is that experience of non-duality, the experience of oneness, while immensely important, is not yet true non-duality. We could say instead that it's really a limited concept of what non-duality is. It's still a strategy that tries to reduce suffering, which is, after all, why all of us are on a spiritual path, because we want to reduce our suffering. In this case, this oneness experience tries to reduce suffering by overcoming the existence of the personal separate ego itself. Now, this is okay. In fact, it's a noble part of the spiritual quest. It's quite important to see that our egos are not the center of the world, that there are other perspectives that we can have. Human beings are capable of having an infinite number of experiences. And the experience of clearing away thoughts and emotions to find a kind of silence and oneness beneath all of perception is one of these fantastic experiences that we can have. But having no thoughts or experiencing primordial oneness is still not what true non-duality is. Ultimately, non-duality is not about getting rid of anything. Wholeness is not found by a devotion to purity, if you will, cutting away as much as possible to find the golden kernel that's real in the center of everything, as if everything else was not real. In fact, and here I'm going to read this passage that I wrote, in fact, we could say that the experience of getting rid of thoughts and feelings, of seeing beyond the ego, is simply a halfway point in the journey that we are all on. In our work, the work that Tim and I do together and we do in the foundation, we have many meditations that can bring people to a state of oneness rather quickly. But we never say to a student that that is the end of the work. In fact, I think we go out of our way to make sure that everybody knows it's just the beginning of the work. Even if it seems that our egos have permanently disappeared somehow, we've only arrived at the beginning of what the non-dual view is pointing toward. The true non-dual view goes much further and must reclaim every part of the human being, no matter how troublesome that part seems in the moment. Again, otherwise, if we don't do that, if that's not our approach, we're cutting away things that we don't like and don't understand, and have not yet brought them into the totality of our being so we can see what true wholeness is like and what happens to our relationship with the universe when we are experiencing and living that type of wholeness, which is different than the oneness experience alone. I wrote, from this point of view, the oneness experience is not an experience we need to hold on to. I have to say, from my personal experience, when I was a young Zen meditator, I had an extraordinarily powerful experience of oneness that was a full body, full mind, full being experience. It was so seductive and beautiful and solved all of my problems that I had, erased all of my suffering, that I spent, I would say, 20 years, one way or the other, trying to reclaim that experience in some manner until that karma wore itself out and I could begin to do the real work. So if we are attached to that oneness experience, we could say that we are creating a hideaway, a protected space of oneness that is either a jail that we have to stay in, that we have to keep in, or we have to have guards on the outside of this jail keeping people away from our wonderful, beautiful oneness experience. Remember, I'm not trying to put down the oneness experience. It's beautiful, it's magnificent. We need to have it. And in fact, not part of what I'm going to talk about today, we need to return to it at the end of our journey in a new way. And by the way, the end of the journey is never. It continues on and on. So true non-duality, from my perspective, is not an experience. It's not a particular experience. It's something beyond an experience, something simpler, we could say. It's a way of living that says that asks us to invite everything in. Let me pause for a moment because I'm not sure if I'm speaking too quickly or too slowly, so I'll take a little moment to catch a breath here. True non-duality sees oneness and separateness not only of equal importance, but as causing the existence of each other, the way foreground and background cause each other. This is a very important point. Let's see, if I hold this pen here, then suddenly we have given birth to foreground and background. They exist together and arose together. No foreground without background. That's why it is foreground. No background without foreground. I hope I said that in reverse just now. They need each other to exist. They are born together at the same moment. Our egoic view of things only can focus on one thing at a time, the foreground, the background. But really, they always come in pairs. In the same way, oneness, the oneness experience, needs duality to exist, and duality needs the oneness experience to exist. The Buddhists call this codependent arising. And that means that everything is born together in an interconnected web and is also different and separate at the same time. This has a lot of implications for our spiritual path. It means that we want to keep some of our smallest parts, our least evolved parts, close at hand in our awareness, along with our courage, along with our suffering, along with our beauty, and so on. All of these things need to be present. In fact, I would say the biggest change in attitude that non-duality brings is that eventually we learn to be happy, that these things are in our consciousness rather than trying to push them away as much as possible. Further, this view is exciting news for us because it means that instead of trying to rid ourselves of our egos, ignoring them or discarding them, we have to bring them close to us and learn to heal them. Because the ego, the healing ego, is the perfect vehicle for our spiritual quest. After all, the universe has been creating selves, galaxy selves and ant selves and Jason selves, and soon you'll meet Tim selves, and so on, and yourself, over and over again since the beginning of time. So there's something intrinsically valuable about the self that should not be discarded, but used, since it has evolved as the perfect vehicle for awakening and enlightening. And while we may have a fantasy of perfection, that we think we get more perfect as we become more awakened and enlightened, and we get the non-dual view in our body, mind, and spirit, true non-duality moves us toward our imperfections and away from an imaginary oneness that doesn't contain them. So the kind of oneness that we're looking for in the totality of our being is one that contains all of our imperfections, all of our smallness, all of our problems, along with all of our greatness, beauty, and courage. And strangely enough, this doesn't mean that they continue in their problematic form. This is part of the healing that non-duality brings. So that's what I want to say as a preamble. Let me just briefly change topics for a moment and talk about something that people who talk about non-duality rarely mention. I'd like to talk about the emotional aspects of non-duality. In other words, what are the emotional consequences of having the non-dual view? Is it just a philosophical perspective? Do we use it as a kind of mantra to get straight with reality? Well, since emotions are such a profound part, a central part of what it means to be human, there must be a connection between what non-duality offers our emotional being. So there are many ways to approach this discussion, and here's another discussion that I wish we had 2 weeks together to talk about together, and maybe I'll write something about it on the foundation website, and you'll be able to go there. By the way, tomorrow you're going to get a notice in your email about a discussion group based on this talk today. It's free, and you can connect at, I think, 11 Eastern time. But in any case, the emotional, let's start with compassion. Let's do that. We'll start with compassion and try to understand the effect that non-duality has upon our emotional body. So where does compassion come from? Is the question that I wanted to ask everybody. Well, my answer is it comes from other people or from books. In other words, we learn it from examples of other people or education, our parents or religious organizations and so on. But where does compassion itself arise from? The answer that I have is that it arises from a heart that is free of its conditioning, a heart that is thriving on the world as it is. This is what I wrote. Instead of a limited world of its own imagination. It comes from a heart that can be moved beyond its own world of personal limitations and fears. From this perspective, we can look at non-duality as a deconditioning agent that works on the soul of the person, removing this conditioning that keeps us from interfacing with reality in a tender and open way, with nothing to defend, or less to defend, since we're human beings and will probably always be imperfect. One of the understandings that the non-dual view brings is this, that we not only need to move closer to our limitations and fears, but we have to have utter kindness about them. These fears and vulnerabilities that have fought so valiantly to defend us against the suffering that life brings. So just as the non-dual view asks us to bring separateness and oneness together into a greater true non-dual oneness, it asks us to bring our smallest parts into our awareness so that they can begin to heal, not so they can disappear, because they are at the core of our humanity, but so that we can become truly human. Non-duality does not bring us to some superconscious, non-human state. In fact, it brings us to a size that is exactly our size, instead of smaller than we are or bigger than we are. A state that has humility and humor and aliveness and authenticity as its basis. I wrote here, our healing depends upon our brokenness. Our healing depends upon our brokenness. How precious our brokenness is then. The other side of this sentence that I wrote is, and our brokenness lets us understand what healing is. Imagine if you were never broken and someone else was, you couldn't possibly understand what that was about. And you couldn't understand the process of healing either. So the non-dual view is a kind view of the universe. It's a friendly view of the universe. And as we walk this path, we begin to see beauty in ourselves, and we begin to see the beauty of nature, and we begin to see the beauty even in the difficulties of human life, of which there are plenty. And as we stop defending territory that we might not have known we were even defending, compassion, remember we asked where that comes from, compassion arises by itself because it comes up from the earth of our being and supports our being the way the earth supports a new plant or a tree or something alive and growing. Non-duality does not impose kindness as a kind of moral victory or a moral imperative. It brings us to our true nature, which is beneficent and compassionate. So that's the healing that the non-dual view brings. And I probably said enough. I'd like to, if Tim is still there, I'd like to bring Tim Rothschild in and say hello and have a conversation. Tim, you there?
Yeah, am I on the screen?
I think so.
Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, it's really good to be here. And that was very well spoken. Very well spoken. You know, it seems pretty important to understand that most of non-duality only goes halfway. So is this your own invention? Something that you realized, or is this something that's out there?
Well, this is a very interesting question you're asking. My spiritual trip has been mostly one of a separate practitioner working in the world and working on my own spiritual path. So all of the things I discovered were self-discovered. That doesn't mean that over the years, as I have discovered these things and articulated them and written about them, that I haven't found echoes, sometimes much better stated than what I've been able to state, from other ancient and older traditions. But I would say in the modern era, in fact, I was just reading something, oh, it's over there, but I was reading something about an early pre-Buddhist school that just yesterday that I deeply agreed with in terms of the unity of the non-dual view. But I would say that in the modern era, when I started talking about this, it wasn't so prevalent. I'm very happy to say that more and more teachers are speaking this way about what non-duality is, but there's still a stream of attachment to the golden horse, if you will, that likes oneness as opposed to duality. Like that first quote that I read, where both the world is not real and also unlike duality, which means two, not one. In other words, oneness doesn't include duality. It's exactly what we want to get away from. When to be a human being, all of our parts need to be cherished and healed, because they don't just remain the same troublesome parts. They remain troubled sometimes, but their troublesomeness decreases, and we become fuller and truly non-dual. So that's the best I can say about that question.
Oh, it's a good answer. And, for people who are just starting the non-dual path, how would they even know if they are including all the parts of themselves? How can we do something like that?
Well, if you're lucky enough to be married, your partner will tell you. So, which is to say, other people are going to tell you, or the society is going to tell you. And by the society, I mean the Chavurah, the Society of Souls, the Foundation, the other travelers, the other spiritual travelers who you're working with. Of course, it always pays to be involved with a spiritual practice. A good spiritual practice is going to constantly unfold your interaction with the smallest parts of yourself. In other words, a spiritual practice is not there for you to have a good time or a bad time. It's there for you to have a time, whatever that time happens to be. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But if you stick with the practice, or in the case of the kind of work we do, have a number of practices that are all penetrating in terms of hitting the problem from various angles, you come up against all of these things. But, to have a teacher, to have guidance, there's nothing like it, right? That's the most important part.
That's the way I like it. So it sounds like the old story of, the guy who's out meditating in the mountains, or he goes into the cave for a bunch of years, achieves enlightenment, and now he comes down into the marketplace, right, and bites the head off the first person that does him wrong, or something like that.
Right. So that's interesting, because, as I was pondering how to talk about this, one of the things I was writing notes about was coming back to the marketplace. Everybody knows about that ultimate moment in the spiritual path where, chubby, fat, and happy, you go back to the children all around you, and you just dispense your wisdom and your happiness, and so on and so on. I think that people mistake what coming back to the marketplace really means. For me, coming back to the marketplace is coming down to earth. That means, beside being fat, chubby, and happy, it also means that you are completely committed to working with your own earthy, smallest parts. That it's no longer a question. You're no longer disappointed by thinking that you are missing high-flown, technicolor, fantastic oneness experiences, but that your oneness really is getting your hands dirty with who you actually are. And you begin to find joy in that, a type of joy that is more profound, I must say, than the exclusivity of the oneness experience. I'll tell you just a little story. I don't know what year it was, someplace in the mid-70s, I found myself in Greece, and I found myself stranded in Greece after a fall in Delphi, where I went to ask the oracle a question. Sounds like I'm in the Matrix here now, right? I went to ask the oracle a question. I fell, I injured my leg, and I had to stay in Greece. I was forced to stay in Greece another 2 weeks. I had to call my boss and say, I can't come back. I have to sit here in Plataea Syntagma, drinking ouzo, writing, and feeling my leg. Well, I had a very big, profound spiritual experience there where I realized the universe in that experience. Of course, as I was reveling in my oneness, in my fantastic oneness, I was feeling uh, I was feeling how sad I felt for all the people around me who were not as one as I was. So you can imagine that level of ignorance and grandiosity soon fell apart, and that oneness died a happy death. Although I was not happy with its dying, but in retrospect, of course, I was happy with its dying. So again, there's all sorts of oneness experiences. Some of them are delusional, and some of them are genuine, but we need to go further and imbue that oneness with the divine aspect, if I can use that word, of separateness as well.
So it sounds like a lot of the time our ideas of what this is supposed to look like are going to be broken down by actually walking the path.
Has that been true for you?
I'd say so, absolutely. You know, I think I'm one of the ones that had the idea of needing to have a certain perfected self, where you read in some of these texts of achieving the rainbow body or having every chakra perfectly opened, you know, and essentially, you know, what I discovered was I was walking through the world like a problem that needed to be solved. So every teacher was used as a helper to help solve my problems. And every person that I ran into, even though I got that this was all designed to help us wake up, it was still held within a smaller context of I'm still a problem and I need to be fixed in some way.
Yes, that's beautiful, Tim. Yeah,
Yeah.
I certainly was there too. You go from practitioner to practitioner, trying to resolve all of these problems, never once thinking that these things are is the word pronounced humus, that black earth, not hummus, humus, that that we need to fertilize our growth. Now, these things make us suffer. I understand that. And we need to investigate them, because if we're suffering too much, we can never get to this level of acceptance. We have to reduce the suffering. And that's part of the psychological aspect of the spiritual path, where we learn the origins of some of our suffering, our misconception, our images, and then can reduce some of that suffering so that we have the airspace, so to speak, to go deeper into the level of acceptance that we need to truly advance on the spiritual path. And by the word advance, I actually mean to return to ourself.
And that's the turn, isn't it? To be able to start to look at what we usually reject or exile or just resist and avoid in our day-to-day lives, whether it's you know, not to wipe out our preferences, right? I can still be me and have the things that I like, but there are certain parts about myself that I may have been kept hidden in some way, or some aspects of my friends or family that just, again, needed to be resolved because they're a problem. And the turn seems to be, how can I let this be the fertilizer for my life, for some new level of understanding or compassion to come forward? Is that true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about is the attempt to live an undefended life. Because in the way that you just spoke, there was nothing that you had to defend against. You were inviting everything in and working with it. That to me is a life well lived.
And that's actually it. I can speak from experience. There's so much joy in having so much less ground to defend. You know, if I can, even at times when I'm meeting new people or if I'm teaching, if I can have the opportunity to say that I can be a real pain in the butt sometimes and name some other qualities about myself that others normally wouldn't like, I'm free in a way that I couldn't have been before. And then there's this other quality that seems to show up, and I think you would call it compassion, that sort of fills the space. And so That's one of my favorite teachings, is having less ground to defend.
Right.
So Jason, we have some questions coming in. Do you want to take a shot at?
Sure, let's go.
Yeah. So first, we've got people from all over: Dusseldorf, Grass Valley, Oakland, New Hampshire, Asheville, Los Angeles, a whole lot of places. A lot of people tuned in right now. So
Great.
Now our first question is from B.J. Miller, and he says, in the book The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhansa Yogananda, it indicates that you must have the dark along with the light, that there can be no motion picture of our life without both. So the question is, does dark and light, or good and evil, not exist in non-duality? Or does one accept and embrace both along with everything else within it?
Well, we have to remember that this is, a dynamic process. Talking about accepting both means that one might think that they remain the same through this acceptance, and that you just have to make room for this evil or this darkness and so on. But non-duality, since things arise together, and when they're held in that way, means that there's already going to be a dynamic relationship and interchange between the dark and the light, and something else will happen. Sometimes we call that in our work the third thing, but something else is going to happen. So there's a transformation of all of that. So it's not a matter of, in the way the question was posed, the person is over here remaining the same, accepting this and this. But that's not what happens. If we think of taking those things into ourselves, they already, and giving them space and room and intelligence, because certain things have to be worked with psychologically, certain things have to be worked with philosophically, meditationally, and so on, then things start changing and moving. It's like a pond doesn't just accept ice and accept steam. It is those things. It's part of its nature is expressed in all those different ways. So we're looking for the origin point where all of these things come from. Now, that was a little complex. I hope that was understandable to our questioner.
Yeah, well, I think maybe they might follow up with another question if they feel like they need to. But it sounds like being the steam, being the ice, being the water. So our ideas of who we are probably going to be changing as we walk the path in this way as well.
Exactly. The entire, in a sense, you gave me a cue there, and I appreciate that. In a sense, in a sense, the spiritual path is about changing our who is. In other words, we have a certain who is. We have a continuum of who is from the most separate who is, where we are an ego and the world is separate from us, or we are a subject and there are objects, or we're the object and there are subjects, and so on, all the way to the other side, where we are one with the universe. This is so one, you can't even see my arm. It's so one over here. So one with the universe. But that continuum, the non-dual view, is that we need to go in this direction and get to that extreme oneness. When that's not the metaphor. The metaphor is to realize that there is this continuum, and that we can be any place on the continuum in a valid way, and that eventually, as we get more proficient, we can choose the syntax of our who is to view the world in different ways when we need to have a different view and when one is more beneficial than the other. So part of the spiritual path is allowing us to see that our who is a mutable thing. And we can't know that because most of the time we keep the who is hidden from ourselves, and we just believe our fixed who is, wherever it happens to be, as our identity. Letting go of that identity, taking that chance and letting it change and letting it be mutable, and swim, we begin to see the entire continuum and realize that we're all of it.
And realizing that we're all of it, what is that experience like for somebody that hasn't had it, at least?
Well, I'm a married person. I've been married for, I don't know how long, 50 years, something like that. It means having a fight with my wife. My wife is my spiritual teacher, and yet we will have fights. It also means that when we have a fight, it's probably over in 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, because we know a lot about that territory and we're not attached to our identity in the same way, so that we can be flexible and move. It also means having ecstatic conversations with my wife. It also means being tired. It also means watching television. It also means watching, rather writing new pieces of literature that I write. And since I'm a songwriter and composer, writing music as well. So there's no particular human experience that for me is not a spiritual experience. All of those things are, and they're all acceptable as well. If I thought that I had to have only good experiences with my beloved, then I would have been divorced a long time ago, because my totality of being could not accept all the different myriad relationships that we have. So the experience of knowing that entire continuum is more and more human, more and more united with my humanity.
Yeah. So it sounds like as our sense of self expands on the level, or relates to the level of reality the way you're talking, it sounds like there might be a danger in choosing one side of reality over another, like only happiness is allowed in a marriage.
Well, people find themselves centered into single experiences because they want certainty in their life. I have a lot of sympathy for that, because life is so unpredictable and uncertain, right? Everybody listening to this knows someone who died when they thought they shouldn't die, right? Oh my goodness, Joe died. I can't believe that happened. Unpredictable. Accidents, COVID, all the things that go on in life. It's totally without predictability on the deepest level. That's very, very hard for a human being to tolerate, especially if they have an unhealed ego that demands things be safe and replicable all the time in a single way. So the danger of, just repeat what you said about the danger of being in one fixed place.
Danger of choosing happiness all the time and not allowing something else.
Well, that's a form of fundamentalism, isn't it? Really, it's a form of puritanical attachment to purity, one thing. That means that everything else that's not that is a danger, which is the definition of fundamentalism. Follow my way and everything else is wrong.
Yeah, but it's like, think about how many people go through their lives, say, just trying to achieve a certain kind of freedom, a certain idea of what freedom is. I'm going to work hard, I'm going to put my time in, and then I'm going to make a lot of money. And I'm going to have that money to be able to choose all of the experiences that will make me happy. And are you saying that this is a problem?
No, it's not a problem. That's great. If someone can make a lot of money and have all kinds of experiences, good for them. It's not going to solve any of the existential problems of life and death. It's not going to solve the problem of having a good, open relationship. It's not going to solve the experience of getting older and having your body hurt and having diminished powers and figuring out what to do with that. It's not going to do any of those. It won't touch any of the existential problems of being a human being, but it will get you a nice car.
Okay, so I want to make sure we get to all of the questions that are coming in. I don't want to hop on myself. So a question from Linda Rothman. She says, I've been studying Buddhism and Hinduism. How is Kabbalah different?
Well, first of all, we can talk about how Buddhism and Hinduism is different. Hinduism's, from my study, Hinduism's idea of non-duality, even in some of the Advaitic sources, is very different from the Buddhist picture of non-duality. And even in the Buddhist world, the Theravadan schools and the Mahayana schools and the Vajrayana schools have different perspectives on non-duality as well. So there's enough to talk about just there without even adding Kabbalah. Now, Kabbalah is the esoteric teaching of Judaism. It was extended into Christian sources and archetypical Jungian sources and so on. But to go to the source of it, of course, it also came before from Egyptian esotericism, but Jewish Kabbalah is in the Jewish tradition. What I was lucky enough to be able to do was to bring a non-dual perspective to Kabbalistic thinking. Non-duality is not traditionally part of Kabbalistic thinking, except at some rarefied and high-level practitioners who hinted at it. What happened to me was that as a Buddhist meditator, because Zen was my chosen path early on, actually I started with Hindu work with Ramakrishna and then went into Buddhist meditation. I lost my train of thought there for a second. Help me out.
I was reading the questions for you. So you were talking about Ramakrishna. You're comparing the different schools of thought.
Got it.
Yeah.
I got it. Thank you. I had an experience where I would go back to Kabbalah all the time because it was the mystical path of my people. And at one point, it opened up to me completely. And I understood that the non-dual perspective that I was experiencing in my meditative states in Buddhism was contained in Kabbalah if we could look at it the right way. And I spent the next number of years creating a non-dual path that was based first in Kabbalistic thinking and then expanded itself into body-centered work, which we do, and into non-dual shamanism, which we do as well.
I have an interesting question here, also from Linda. And she says, let me get it again. I've been studying, no, that's the wrong one. She called you 20 years ago. This is the one. She called you 20 years ago and asking to work with you. And she was told that she was not ready. So how did you know? And I think, expand that to how can anybody know?
Well, first of all, did she agree with me?
I think she did. She says, I think I understand now.
Well, first of all, when you're talking to someone on this level, you're talking to them as a soul, and you want the very best for them, and you want them to succeed, and you want them to grow. So working with me or not working with me is a question about which will make them grow and succeed better. So so that's my ground level. My ground level is work with me is not always a good thing. It has to be at the right time and the right moment. So that's what I sense into, always with the bottom line of wanting the best for that person and wanting them to succeed and grow. So I don't remember my call with Linda, but probably I felt that was not the best way for her to grow at that point. I hope she agrees.
I can feel the integrity in what you're doing. And I think it's wonderful. And everybody can benefit from understanding that there is a time and place for this particular kind of work. And at the same time, I'm wondering, so we're hearing that right now, can they get involved in non-duality right now? Is that something anybody can do, or is there some sort of a prerequisite?
It's an interesting question. First of all, they have to have some place to go. The foundation is busy just starting to create programs so that people can begin doing this kind of work. I would suggest that people read some of the books that I've created. The essays in Beyond the Now are very accessible. For those who are interested in Buddhism, there's a small, beautiful book called Rebreathing the Four Noble Truths that a dear friend of mine who's a Zen teacher did the illustrations for. For those who are interested in shamanistic work, there's the Non-Dual Shaman, which is really a very advanced and elevated text, and usually should be, I guess, can be used with a teacher, but can be read alone as well. So, as I mentioned, tomorrow there's going to be a discussion with two of the senior people in the foundation, Tadeya Bradish and Beth Almarini, and people who are on this call will get a notice of how to join that for free. So we hope to hold those discussion groups more and more as I do more of these live events. And that's a way for a community to be formed where people can support each other and start exploring these ideas. And then down the line, we want to start having programs that people can join. Those are still in their infancy, but we're working on them.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Ready for another question?
Yeah, sure.
So this is from BJ Miller. Is there any call to action within non-duality at this particular time on the planet? He says there are many light workers are speaking urgently in this language right now, or is it about leading by example and raising the planetary vibration by achieving non-duality ourselves, or is it none of the above?
Well, I have a particular prejudice here, so let me expose that as part of my answer. I really feel it goes back to the individual. Each individual is responsible for healing their own body, mind, and spirit. When we do that, we're doing it in the safest and deepest way. If we're getting on a bandwagon of light workers, then we may have left out all the non-light workers or the light workers we don't agree with or something like that. So I think that the first thing that people have to do is to begin working on ourselves, definitely. Then you join with other like-minded people whose commitment is not to an abstract idea of light workers, but to the idea of using this rectified self in concert with people to heal the earth, to heal political situations, and so on. One of the books that I wrote was called The Magi Process. The Magi Process is about healing conflict, whether between organizations, between individuals, or within an individual through non-dual means. There are small Magi groups around the world at this point. I'm sure if someone writes to the foundation and wants to get connected with a Magi group, that would be a great thing to do. I didn't realize I could say that. For people who are interested, if they write to the foundation, and the foundation's website is non-duality, one word, .us.com. I'm sure we could hook you up with various Magi groups and stuff like that. So I want to make sure that people are willing to do the work themselves. I think that's where the integrity comes from, and then joining with other like-minded people. Of course, that's not exactly true, because sometimes joining with like-minded people inspires you to do the work. So as long as we end up doing the work, I think either way, that's what's necessary.
Okay. And one final question. This is from Gina. Choosing to only think positively certainly has become very trendy and might have its place. So how does a non-dual practitioner meet a think positive mentality?
Wow. I always like that, Gina. Any practice can be used to hide a multitude of sins, so to speak. So positive thinking, for instance, can hide all the sorrow and sadness that needs to be opened up, needs to be touched, that needs to be healed. At the same point, positive thinking is a very important thing and a very useful tool for a human being alive. Zen meditation can be a fantastic path. And I know people who have sat for many, many years who have gotten nowhere, who've just become stiff sticks sitting there on their cushion. People could use non-duality in the same way to make a castle in oneness and never come back to the marketplace, as we talked about before. So there's nothing wrong with positive thinking. In fact, with my personality, I probably could use a little bit more of it, actually. What we want to do is to come to these things honestly and to always have a multitude of practices so that one doesn't get top heavy and one doesn't give us a chance to avoid ourselves. Remember, we want to have the totality of our being present, because something magical and wonderful that is earned comes about as we begin to see the world in its true non-duality. We begin to see this vast poem where everything is beautifully connected and working in its terrible and beautiful way, because that's where we live, in a world of terribleness and beautifulness, if you will. So I hope that answers Gina's question a little bit.
I think so. And it begs another comment. I just want to say that's what I love about non-duality, is that we, in a certain sense, can't escape it. So as we do the work, it's like whatever is here now appearing in our lives, whether it's a joy and beauty or sorrow and despair, we can work with it and it can help us.
Exactly. And I'll just say this last thing, although that's a beautiful way to end, Tim, what you just said. It's because non-duality is the way the world is and who we are. It's not a new discovery to be grafted onto us as a new perspective. It's really an uncovering and an unfolding of who we already are. It's prior existence in us and in the world and our connection. We're not making a connection with the world. We're realizing the connection that we have with the world. So I guess we're going to sign off in a minute or two. Tim, it's been an absolute joy talking with you. Really, it's beautiful. You're just so alive. It's just great. I love it. And I want to thank Julie Coriel. As I said, she's behind the scenes in some cyberspace, and Jared Drake, who's in a different cyberspace. And we'll see you again. Visit our website, nonduality.us.com. You can, if you'd like, donate there to help us with our work. And we're going to continue these conversations in the future, maybe in a slightly different format. Maybe if we can gather more people, we can do something live and have a long conversation. But in any case, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the questions that we've gotten. And Tim, I love you, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye, everybody.